It didn't begin with a public announcement or a palace statement, it began with silence. A silence so deliberate it felt engineered. Behind closed doors, aides moved differently, security logs shifted, and one name quietly disappeared from internal systems. Queen Camilla. Within hours, whispers turned into alarm. Something had changed. And this time, it wasn't temporary, it was permanent. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the changes were so subtle they almost escaped notice. A badge that no longer granted access. A door that required a second authorization. A routine that for years had unfolded with mechanical precision, suddenly interrupted without explanation. Those within the inner workings of the palace, those who understood how power truly functioned behind gilded walls, felt it immediately. Something had shifted beneath the surface, and it was not accidental. It was deliberate, controlled, and above all, silent. Reports began to circulate in hushed tones, suggesting that internal palace systems had flagged irregularities, unusual access changes tied to personnel who had long been considered untouchable. But no one dared say it aloud. Not yet. Then came the first undeniable sign. Staff members closely associated with Camilla found their routines disrupted. Meetings postponed, clearances delayed, instructions rerouted through unfamiliar channels. There was no official statement, no confrontation, no visible conflict. Just a slow, methodical tightening of control. Senior aides, usually quick to clarify even the smallest procedural adjustments, were suddenly restrained. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Questions were met with silence. It wasn't confusion, it was containment. And within that containment, a narrative was quietly forming. Security rotations, too, began to change. Not dramatically, but enough for those paying attention to notice. Guards reassigned. Schedules adjusted. Access points monitored with a precision that hinted at something far more serious than routine restructuring. The kind of changes that don't happen unless someone, somewhere, has decided that the existing order can no longer be trusted. And at the center of it all was a phrase that began to circulate among insiders, a confidential internal review. No details. No confirmations, just a phrase, repeated often enough to carry weight, but never enough to reveal its full meaning. And then there was William, not visible, not vocal, but unmistakably present. His office, usually measured and predictable in its activity, had become a quiet epicenter of movement. Documents reviewed, consultations held, decisions made behind layers of discretion. Those familiar with the rhythms of royal operations began to connect the dots. This wasn't random. It wasn't reactive. It was strategic. A response not to a single incident, but to something deeper, something that had been building over time. What made it more unsettling was the absence of resistance. No public denial, no quiet pushback, just a stillness that suggested inevitability, as if the outcome had already been decided long before the first access point was restricted. As if everyone involved understood that this moment had been coming, even if no one had spoken of it openly. And in that silence, the weight of the situation became impossible to ignore. Because in a system where every action is calculated, where every movement carries meaning, silence is never empty. It is intentional, it is powerful. And sometimes, it is the loudest signal of all. But this wasn't just a quiet administrative shift, it was the opening move in a calculated operation that had been building for months. The review wasn't supposed to surface. Conducted under layers of discretion, it moved through palace channels like a shadow unseen, unacknowledged and dangerously precise. But as fragments began to leak, one truth became impossible to ignore: this was no routine evaluation. It was an audit with consequences targeted, deliberate, and aimed directly at the Queen Consort herself. At first, it existed only as a whisper among those who understood how these mechanisms worked, an internal process, quietly authorized, never meant to be questioned. Reports suggest that approval came from the highest level, though never formally acknowledged, giving the operation a weight that could not be challenged. It didn't arrive with declarations or formal announcements. It arrived in files, in quiet requests for records, in sudden interest in details that had long been overlooked. And those details, once ignored, were now being examined with a level of scrutiny that felt almost surgical. The focus, insiders claim, was not broad, it was precise. Staff conduct, access privileges, influence networks that had quietly expanded over time, the kind of elements that rarely attract attention unless someone decides they should. And when that decision is made, it is never accidental. It is calculated. It is strategic. Those familiar with palace operations began to sense a pattern forming, one that pointed not to routine maintenance, but to a deeper concern, something described in careful language as operational boundaries. A phrase that sounds harmless on the surface, but within these walls, carries an entirely different weight. Because operational boundaries are not just guidelines, they are lines of control. Lines that define who holds influence, who exercises authority, and who is permitted to move within the inner structure of the monarchy without resistance. And according to those quietly observing this unfolding process, those lines had begun to blur. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually over time, through decisions that seemed minor in isolation but significant when viewed together. The kind of shift that doesn't trigger immediate alarm, but eventually demands correction. What made the situation more volatile was the timing. King Charles's ongoing health struggles had already introduced a sense of fragility into the system. A monarchy that thrives on continuity and certainty was now navigating uncertainty. And in moments like these, even the smallest imbalance can feel magnified. Reports indicate that this was not lost on those overseeing the review. In fact, it may have accelerated the process. Because when the center weakens, the structure must compensate. And compensation, in this case, meant control. That control, it is widely believed, was being exercised by figures increasingly aligned with William. Not openly, not aggressively, but unmistakably. A quiet consolidation of oversight, a subtle shift in who was asking the questions, who was reviewing the answers, and ultimately who was making the decisions. It wasn't a takeover, it was something more refined. A repositioning. One that allowed authority to move without confrontation, without spectacle, but with undeniable impact. As the review progressed, tension began to build not in public, but within the intricate network of relationships that define palace life. Conversations became more cautious, alliances more visible. The distance between different factions, once manageable, began to widen. And while no one spoke openly about conflict, the signs were there. In hesitation, in silence, in the careful choice of words that revealed more than they concealed. Because beneath the surface, something larger was taking shape. Not just a review, but a reckoning. A moment where long-standing dynamics were being questioned, re-evaluated, and possibly redefined. And as each layer of that hidden process was uncovered, the implications became harder to contain. And as the findings of that hidden review began to take shape, they pointed towards something far more explosive than anyone had anticipated. At first, it sounded like speculation, then like concern, and finally like confirmation. Something had happened, something that insiders now describe as a breach, not of law, but of protocol. And within the rigid architecture of royal tradition, that distinction changes everything. Because in the monarchy, protocol isn't suggestion, it's power. What began as quiet unease soon hardened into something far more serious. Reports suggest that certain lines long understood but rarely spoken of, had been crossed. Not in a dramatic public way, but in the kind of subtle, calculated manner that only those deeply embedded within the system could execute. Allegations started to surface, carefully worded, cautiously shared, pointing toward an overreach that extended beyond what was considered acceptable. not illegal, not overtly defiant, but deeply disruptive to the invisible order that governs everything behind palace doors. At the center of these concerns was the question of authority: who held it, who exercised it, and more importantly, who had begun to stretch it. Insiders whisper that staff roles, once clearly defined, had started to blur. Boundaries between personal influence and official responsibility became increasingly difficult to distinguish. Decisions that should have followed established channels appeared to move through alternative routes, guided not by protocol, but by proximity and preference. And in a system built on hierarchy and precision, even the smallest deviation can trigger a cascade of consequences. There were also murmurs of external connections, relationships, and communications that, while not forbidden, raised questions about influence. Who was advising whom? Who was being heard? And why were certain decisions beginning to reflect priorities that didn't align with the traditional structure of royal governance? These weren't accusations made lightly. They were concerns, raised in private, discussed behind closed doors, and according to multiple accounts, taken seriously enough to reach the highest levels. What makes this moment even more critical is the growing belief that this wasn't sudden, that it had been building, quietly. Gradually, reports indicate that senior royals had been privately alerted weeks earlier, long before any internal review was formally acknowledged. Warnings were given, observations shared, but for reasons still unclear, the response was measured, perhaps even delayed. Until now. Because something had changed, something that shifted the situation from manageable to irreversible. That shift, insiders claim, marked a point of no return, a moment where the balance could no longer be maintained through quiet adjustments or internal conversations, a moment where action became not just necessary, but inevitable. And as that realization spread through the upper ranks of the monarchy, one figure began to emerge, not loudly, not publicly, but with unmistakable clarity. William, increasingly positioned not just as the future, but as the present force of decision-making. His role, once defined by preparation and support, began to take on a different weight, a more immediate authority, one that didn't wait for consensus, but moved with purpose. Those observing closely noted the shift, the way decisions began to align, the way processes accelerated, the way silence, once protective, became directive. Because in a structure where tradition dictates every move, stepping beyond protocol is never a small matter. It is a signal, a warning, and sometimes a challenge. And when that challenge is recognized, the response is never casual. It is calculated, it is precise, and it is decisive. And once that line had been crossed, there was only one figure left willing and able to respond. He didn't hesitate. While others debated and delayed, Prince William acted. Quietly, decisively, and without spectacle. Orders were issued, systems updated, privileges revoked. It wasn't a confrontation, it was a reset. And in that moment, the future king made one thing unmistakably clear: the balance of power inside the palace had shifted. What followed was not chaos, but precision. Reports suggest that the authorization came swiftly, moving through internal administrative channels with a clarity that left little room for interpretation. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public declarations, only a series of calculated adjustments that began to take effect almost immediately. Access privileges, once assumed permanent, were suddenly conditional. Systems that had long operated without interruption were recalibrated. And within those changes, a message was embedded, subtle, but unmistakable. Control was being reasserted. Those familiar with the inner mechanics of royal administration recognized the pattern. This was not reactionary. It was structured. Each move aligned with established protocols, yet carried an urgency that set it apart. Insiders whisper that William worked in close coordination with senior figures known for their uncompromising adherence to tradition, individuals who view protocol not as a guideline, but as a safeguard. Together, they formed a quiet coalition, one that moved not with noise, but with authority. And that authority was now being exercised with a level of decisiveness that had not been seen in years. What makes this intervention particularly striking is its restraint. There was no attempt to control the narrative publicly, no effort to justify or explain. The absence of explanation became part of the strategy, because within the monarchy, silence is often more powerful than words. It allows actions to stand on their own, to carry weight without dilution. And in this case, those actions spoke volumes. They signaled a shift from observation to enforcement, from concern to correction. At its core, this was about stability. Or at least, that is how it was framed by those closest to the process. A broader effort, insiders claim, to stabilize operations during a period of increasing uncertainty. With King Charles's health continuing to cast a shadow over the institution, the need for clarity and control had become more pressing. And William, stepping into that space, appeared determined to ensure that the structure remained intact, even if that meant making decisions that would ripple through the system. But beneath that objective lay something more complex. A leadership style that was evolving in real time. No longer confined to preparation or symbolic roles, William was beginning to operate with a level of authority that reflected not just his future position, but his present influence. The way decisions were made, the speed at which they were implemented, the confidence with which they were executed. All of it pointed to a transformation, one that was as significant as it was understated. And for those on the receiving end of these changes, the impact was immediate, not just in terms of access or authority, but in perception. The understanding that the rules, while unchanged in principle, were now being enforced with renewed intensity. That proximity no longer guaranteed protection. That influence, once taken for granted, could be recalibrated without warning. Because in a system built on continuity, decisive action is never just about the present. It is a signal to the future, a declaration of intent. And in this case, that intent was clear. The monarchy would not drift. It would be directed. But decisive action always comes at a cost, and this move would send shockwaves far beyond palace walls. The aftermath was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Alliances shifted overnight. And within the palace, the atmosphere turned unmistakably cold. For those closest to Camilla, the message was clear: something fundamental had changed. And for the first time in years, uncertainty replaced confidence. What had once been a carefully balanced environment where influence flowed quietly and relationships operated with unspoken understanding was now fractured. Reports suggest that staff divisions deepened almost instantly, not through open conflict, but through subtle realignments. People who once worked seamlessly together began to separate into quiet factions. Words were measured more carefully. Meetings became more selective. And beneath it all, a growing awareness settled in. The internal structure was no longer stable. Those within Camilla's inner circle felt the shift most sharply. Insiders whisper that individuals who once moved with ease through the palace's intricate network now found themselves on the margins. Not dismissed, not formally removed, but unmistakably sidelined. Invitations slowed. Access narrowed. Influence, once assumed, became conditional. It wasn't a purge, it was something more controlled. A gradual distancing that carried a deeper message, one that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. At the same time, scrutiny intensified. Communications, both formal and informal, were reportedly observed with a level of attention that hadn't been present before. Movements tracked. Interactions noted. The kind of oversight that signals not just caution but concern. And for those accustomed to operating within a certain degree of autonomy, this sudden shift felt less like protection and more like containment. Every action now carried weight. Every decision, consequence. Senior aides, many of whom had long served as stabilizing forces within the palace, began to find their roles quietly adjusted. Some were reassigned, others distanced from their previous responsibilities. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but in ways that altered the internal dynamic. Relationships that had taken years to build were suddenly disrupted. Trust, once implicit, now required validation, and in that process, the cohesion that had defined palace operations began to unravel. What made the situation even more volatile was the growing sense of instability that followed. Not visible to the public, but deeply felt within the institution itself. A system that relies on continuity and precision was now navigating uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, every decision became more significant, every silence more telling. Because when the structure begins to shift, even slightly, the effects are never isolated. At the center of it all stood King Charles' court, as reports suggest, between competing pressures. On one side, the need to maintain unity. On the other, the reality of a situation that could no longer be ignored. His position, already complicated by ongoing health concerns, became even more delicate. Decisions that might once have been straightforward now carried layers of implication. And in those moments, hesitation was not just understandable, it was inevitable. Because this was no longer just about internal adjustments or administrative control. It was about balance, about authority, about the future direction of the monarchy itself. And as those within the palace struggled to adapt to the new reality, one question lingered beneath the surface: what happens next? Yet even as tensions escalated behind closed doors, the true meaning of this moment was only just beginning to emerge. This was never just about staff privileges. It was about control, about legacy, about who defines the future of the monarchy in a moment of vulnerability. Because with the crown under pressure, every decision carries weight, and every silence speaks volumes. What had begun as a quiet administrative shift now revealed itself as something far more consequential. Reports suggest that the urgency behind these decisions was deeply tied to King Charles's ongoing health crisis, an unspoken reality that hovered over every conversation, every action, every hesitation. In times of strength, the monarchy moves with patience. But in moments of uncertainty, patience becomes a risk. And for those tasked with protecting the institution, risk is something that must be managed, contained, and if necessary, eliminated. That sense of urgency, subtle at first, began to shape the pace of events in ways that could no longer be ignored. Within that shifting landscape, William's role continued to evolve, not through declaration but through presence, through action, through the quiet assumption of responsibility that others seemed increasingly willing to defer to. Insiders whisper that decisions once routed through multiple channels were now moving with greater directness, often aligning with William's perspective. It wasn't an official transition of power, but it felt like one. A gradual repositioning that reflected not just preparation for the future, but adaptation to the present. And with that adaptation came questions, not publicly, not formally, but persistently. What does leadership look like in this moment? Who sets the direction when the traditional center is under strain? And perhaps most importantly, how does the monarchy maintain its identity while navigating a period of internal recalibration? These weren't questions with easy answers, but they were being asked quietly, carefully, and with increasing frequency. Palace insiders describe what is happening not as a crisis, but as a recalibration of power, a phrase that suggests adjustment rather than disruption. But beneath that language lies a deeper reality. Recalibration implies that something was out of balance, that the existing structure, while functional, required correction. And correction in an institution as layered as the monarchy is never simple. It touches everything. Relationships, roles, expectations. It forces a re-examination of what is essential and what is expendable. History, of course, offers its own perspective. The monarchy has faced moments like this before, periods where internal tensions surfaced, where authority was questioned, where the future seemed uncertain. And each time the outcome was shaped not just by decisions, but by timing, by who acted and when, by who held firm and who adapted. Those parallels, though rarely spoken aloud, linger in the background, adding weight to the present moment. Outside the palace, curiosity has begun to grow, not fueled by official statements, but by absence, by the lack of clarity that invites speculation. The public, accustomed to a certain level of transparency, now finds itself piecing together fragments, trying to understand a story that is being told in silence. And that silence, once protective, now carries a different tone, one that suggests something significant is unfolding, even if its full shape remains hidden. Because this is what moments of transition look like within the monarchy. Not loud, not chaotic, but deliberate, controlled, and deeply consequential. Every action, no matter how small, contributes to a larger narrative, one that will define not just the present, but the future. And as history has shown, moments like these don't fade quietly, they reshape everything that follows. What the public sees is only the surface. Beneath it lies a far more complex reality, a silent struggle unfolding in corridors where decisions are never accidental. Every move, every restriction, every absence tells a story. And right now, that story is one of control being reclaimed, piece by piece. For years, there had been an unspoken tension running through the monarchy, a quiet divide between those who believed in preserving tradition at all costs and those who saw adaptation as inevitable. It wasn't a conflict that ever reached the surface, not in any obvious way. Instead, it lived in decisions, in preferences, in the subtle shaping of priorities. Reports suggest that this divide had been widening long before the current moment. But it was only now, under pressure, that it began to reveal itself with clarity. On one side stood the traditionalists, figures deeply rooted in the belief that the monarchy's strength lies in its consistency, its adherence to structure, its refusal to bend to external influence. For them, protocol is not restrictive, it is protective. It preserves the institution's identity, shields it from instability, and ensures continuity across generations. On the other side were those who operated with a more fluid understanding of influence, individuals who recognized the changing landscape and sought to navigate it with flexibility, even if that meant stretching the boundaries of established norms. Neither side openly declared itself, but the difference in approach was unmistakable. As the internal review unfolded and its consequences began to ripple outward, these underlying tensions sharpened. Strategic positioning became more visible, not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet alignments. Who stood with whom? Who was consulted? Who was no longer included? Insiders whisper that conversations once shared among a broad circle were now confined to smaller, more deliberate groups. Decisions were no longer just about outcomes, they were about alliances. And those alliances were shifting. There were also indications, subtle but consistent, of coordinated efforts behind the scenes, not orchestrated in the sense of conspiracy, but aligned in purpose. Senior figures, advisors, and long-standing institutional voices appeared to move with a shared understanding, as though responding to a common signal. The influence of legacy institutions, those that have quietly guided the monarchy through decades of change, became more pronounced. Their presence, often invisible to the public, was now shaping the direction of events with a steady, deliberate hand. Within this evolving landscape, authority itself began to change form, not transferred, not reassigned, but redefined. Power, once distributed through a complex web of relationships and roles, started to concentrate. Gradually. Carefully. In ways that didn't disrupt the surface, but altered the foundation. Those who understood the system could see it happening, a recalibration that extended beyond individual decisions and into the very structure of how the monarchy operated. And perhaps most striking of all was how quietly this transformation was taking place. No declarations, no visible upheaval, just a series of adjustments that, taken together, signaled something profound. The monarchy was not just responding to a moment, it was redefining itself within it, adapting without admitting it, changing without announcing it, and in doing so, setting the stage for what comes next. Because beneath the controlled narrative, beneath the carefully maintained silence, the momentum continues to build. Each decision adds weight. Each shift carries consequence. And eventually, even the most carefully managed transformation reaches a point where it can no longer remain hidden. But even the most carefully controlled narratives can't stay hidden forever, and what comes next could change everything. In the end, it wasn't announced. It wasn't declared. It simply happened. A new order, quietly within the monarchy, one where authority is clearer, lines are sharper, and loyalty is no longer assumed. For some it marks stability. For others, it signals something far more unsettling. What had been building beneath the surface through silence, through subtle decisions, through carefully controlled shifts had now taken form. Not as a sudden upheaval, but as a transformation so precise it almost escaped notice. And yet, for those paying attention, the signs were undeniable. William's influence, once emerging, now stood firmly established. Not through ceremony, not through proclamation, but through action, through presence, through the quiet assumption of responsibility that left little doubt about where the future of the monarchy was heading. This was not just about one decision or one moment, it was about a broader redefinition of how the institution would operate moving forward. Reports suggest that institutional control had become the priority, placed above personal relationships, above long-standing dynamics, above anything that could introduce instability. The message, though never spoken aloud, was clear: the monarchy would endure, but it would do so on its own terms. And those terms were being reinforced with a level of discipline that left little room for ambiguity. Within that recalibration, Camilla's role began to shift, not dramatically, not publicly, but significantly. The influence that once flowed through familiar channels now encountered resistance. Access, once routine, became structured. Presence, once assumed, became conditional. It wasn't removal, it was redefinition. A repositioning that altered the internal balance without disrupting the external image. And in that contrast lies the true complexity of what has taken place. Because while the internal structure was evolving, the public narrative remained carefully managed. No confirmations, no denials, just a continuity that suggested stability, even as the foundation beneath it adjusted. This duality change beneath the surface, consistency above it, is what allows the monarchy to navigate moments like this without fracturing. But it also means that the full extent of that change is rarely visible until long after it has occurred. Palace operations, too, began to reflect this new reality. Processes streamlined, decision-making centralized, the intricate web of influence that once defined internal dynamics gradually replaced by a more focused structure. One that prioritizes clarity over complexity, control over flexibility. And while this may bring stability, it also introduces a new kind of tension, one that comes from knowing that the margins for deviation have narrowed. For those within the institution, this moment will not be remembered for what was said, but for what was done. For the quiet decisions that reshaped relationships. For the subtle actions that redefined authority. For the realization that the monarchy, even in its most traditional form, is capable of change when the moment demands it. And beyond the palace walls, this stands as a defining chapter in modern royal history. Not because of its visibility, but because of its impact. A shift that will influence not just the present, but the future. A moment where the balance was tested and ultimately reset. Because in the monarchy, power is never truly lost, it's only reassigned. often long before the world even notices. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.